Hello, everyone, and welcome to End of Life University podcast, where we share real talk about life and death. I'm your host, Dr. Karen Wyatt. Thanks for being here with me today for episode number 263, which is the first of two episodes in a row where we're going to be talking about grief. I feel like grief is a really important subject right now, as we are at the beginning of the month of September in the year 2020 and still in the middle of a global pandemic from the coronavirus. And many of us are dealing with grief for all sorts of losses that we've experienced this past year. And so today's interview will be with Lindsey Fenton, who is the creator, producer, director of the film Speaking Grief. And we'll be talking about really acknowledging our grief as a society and helping one another with grief by being able to come together, be present with one another during times of grief. And so that, I think, is the first step we all need to experience in order to deal with this grief we're experiencing as a collective community. And then next week, my interview will be with Brian Smith, and he'll be talking about his podcast and book called Grief to Growth. And so in that episode, we're continuing on with looking at grief and how we deal with it and manage it. And once we've recognized it, acknowledged it, validated it, and sat with it, we can begin to look toward the idea of growth through and because of our grief. Not that happens for everyone, and not that everyone is ready for that to happen, but I just wanted to present two different ways of looking at grief for your consideration. So we'll get on with my interview with Lindsey in just a few minutes. First, I have a couple of announcements. One is, again, I'll remind you, Suzanne O'Brien and I are teaching a course that starts in just about 10 days called Top Lessons Learned from Those at the End of Life, How to Be Resilient During Difficult Times. And so Suzanne and I are really bringing together, between the two of us, really all of the spiritual inspiration that we've received from working with hospice patients at the end of life. We'll be sharing a lot of our insights, the tools that we use, and really trying to offer something that can be of help to people going through these challenging times together, and hoping that we can help you utilize these experiences we're having as perhaps a means or a pathway towards some spiritual growth. So that's coming up. The workshop starts on September 16th. You can sign up at any time. I'll put the link for a page where you can learn more about the workshop and also register for it if you're interested in joining us. So the workshop has 3 modules, 3 weeks in a row, September 16th, 23rd, and 30th. We'll be meeting for an hour and a half for each one of those modules. Then we're also having a follow-up session 4 weeks later at the end of October, so we can come together again as a group and talk about how we're doing and really look back on any changes we've been making and how that's working for us. So there will be homework assignments each week, things to work on, practices to learn, and that will continue on during the 4 weeks in between the last module and our follow-up session. So take a look if you're interested. We'd love to have you join us. We know certain people will resonate with it, others will not. If it feels right to you, we'd love to have you be part of our group that comes together at the end of the month. Also, I will post a link. Suzanne and I did one of her life classes together for her doula givers group last week, and I'll post a link to that video of the two of us talking in general. And we summarized a bit about the course. If you want to hear a little bit more about it, I'll post a link to that as well, so you can check out that video. So just go to the show notes for this episode at eolupodcast.com, and you'll see the links for the course there and everything you need in order to sign up. Also, I wanted to mention to you a couple of blogs I've written in the last week that you might be interested in. I'm trying to put some information out there to offer a little bit of hope, because these days are starting to feel dark to many of us, I know. And so I really want to be creating content and information that provides you with hope and love and encouragement to get through each day. So I have 2 blogs that you can read. One is called Seeing the Light Over Lobster Tempura, and the second one is Something Beautiful is Happening. And there will be links for both of those blogs also in the show notes. On eolupodcast.com. Just go to episode number 263. Now we'll move on to my interview with Lindsey about the film Speaking Grief. And as always, stay tuned after the interview, and I'll come back with a few takeaways and to say goodbye. So here we go. Today, I'm very excited to welcome my guest, Lindsey Whissel Fenton. Lindsey is a senior producer at WPSU, the PBS NPR affiliate station in central Pennsylvania. She is an Emmy award-winning storyteller who is passionate about using public media to build empathy, which I love. Lindsey produced, directed, and wrote the documentary Speaking Grief, and continues to produce content for the initiative's website and social media presence. The Speaking Grief initiative has been praised for its sensitivity, authenticity, and inclusivity, as well as its comprehensive exploration of the reality of grief. And you can find out more about Speaking Grief at the website speakinggrief.org. And Lindsey's website is Lindsey Whissel, Wissel, lindseywisselfenton.com. So Lindsey, thank you so much for joining me today.
Thanks so much for having me, Karen.
I'm a huge fan of the film Speaking Grief since I had the chance to watch it. So I'm very excited to talk to you about that. But I thought we could start, as I always try to start these conversations, by just hearing a little bit more about you and your story and how you were inspired to create the documentary Speaking Grief.
Sure. Well, and you can't see I have a big smile on my face that you like the documentary. That means so much to me. So thank you. So I have worked in public media for about 12 years now. And somewhere along the way, I always like to give credit where credit's due. A brilliant former colleague of mine named Patty Satalia had proposed the idea of us doing some sort of program on grieving the loss of a child. And Patty's since retired, but at some point I had raised my hand when I heard that topic and said I would really love to be involved in this in some way. And just the way things go in any kind of nonprofit, public media is no different. There's usually some fits and starts, and we have to see if it's something we can fund, and there's an appetite for. And so the project actually started back in, I want to say 2015 or 2016, and I just delved into the research. I was so fascinated by this area because it's something that we all go through, right? We all grieve so many different things throughout our lives. But when I started delving into it, there really just wasn't that much. There's a lot in terms of resources that grief organizations and people put out that are wonderful resources. But in terms of mainstream conversation, those don't tend to be things people look at unless they have no other choice, unless they are, experiencing grief or trying to support someone in their life who is. And so we thought public media was the perfect platform for bringing this into the mainstream. Something we also look for are projects that, obviously, we like producing great content, great video content, like the documentary. But we also look for things where we can really start educational initiatives, and that's what Speaking Grief is. And we can definitely talk more about the components of that project. But we really felt that this was such a critical need that wasn't being addressed. So I really quickly became a passionate, grief advocate, just seeing how much hurt there was out there, not just from grief itself, but from our misunderstanding around it. And I guess that's truly where my passion started. Was I thought, we all want to be able to be there for the people we care about. We just don't know how, because nobody talks about it. Nobody teaches us about it. And so that part of it really just connected with me, was the ability to give people the tools they need to show up for each other, myself included. I mean, we've all been there. We've all been in those conversations, in those moments where you just are kind of stunned into silence because you just don't know what else to do or say, not realizing how hurtful that silence and that distance can be. So yeah, I started back in about 2016, and since then it has been a really remarkable, beautiful, sometimes heavy journey. But my whole team and I'll say, we've had many conversations and just random texts back and forth. We just love this work so much. Like, this is the project that is the reason a lot of us chose to work in public media, was for the opportunity to maybe get to work on something like this that has such potential to inspire real change in how we relate to each other. So I absolutely love this work. I love the people I've gotten to meet, and I'm so grateful for those people and for the trust that they've had in our team to share these stories, and the people who so courageously and generously share their stories in the hopes of helping others.
Well, I love that your bio, as I mentioned, says that you're passionate about using public media to build empathy, which is exactly what the documentary does, I believe. It really does build empathy. And you mentioned how important it is that we have media available for all of the people who are not currently experiencing grief, to become more aware of grief and to start to recognize it in people around them. And so this entire project, as you said, I agree with you. There are a lot of resources available for people who are in the midst of their own grief. But you're right, to really make change, we have to reach out to those of us who are not at this time experiencing grief, even though all of us will at some point in our lives, because we need this general education and greater awareness about the process of grief and how that affects us. So I'm so grateful that you have had that awareness. And I think I've heard you mention before, without having gone through a major grief experience in a way yourself, or a death. I read that in one of your other bios, that you came to this awareness just of your own understanding and looking around you at the world.
Yeah. And I'm so glad you brought that up, because that's something that has come up so much throughout this project, is people tend to assume that that I would have been motivated to do this by, kind of a transformative, life-changing loss. And I always like to say, I'm not downplaying the losses I've had. I've lost people in my family. I've lost people and things that, that I care about and that I do grieve, but I haven't had one of those kind of big life-altering losses yet. I always say yet, because it's like, that's, I always say, spoiler alert, that's kind of part of being human, is that, I think for me, I really like looking at the things that we share as humans, and grief is perhaps the only thing that is really universal. Well, love is too, right? Because grief is part of love. So it's like this experience, it just really stuck with me how we all go through this and we all have a stake in it, but we don't acknowledge it. And so the fact that people make that assumption about me is really telling. It's like, why would somebody be so passionate about this if they hadn't been there? And I actually will say too, I think that has helped the project a little bit, is that I am sort of on the outside of things, because I can identify with the support role. I've been there with people I care about, even recently, even since doing this work, because we're really kind of deeply programmed into sort of our tropes about, air quotes, offering support. And it's hard to change that. It takes a lot of conscious effort. But I think that sort of gave me the ability to come at it with, what are the questions that people are going to have, or where are the places that we tend to feel helpless or we tend to misstep, and serve both populations. Because by helping those of us wanting to support somebody get better at this, we're also helping stem that isolation that comes for the people who are in the midst of grief.
Well, I wanted to give listeners kind of an overview of this beautiful documentary, but then also the Speaking Grief website and initiative, which I discovered later after I watched the film, how many resources are available there. But I wanted to make a comment that the film, I just think this is a brilliant opening, shows people wearing T-shirts with the descriptor of a loved one who has died, like mom or brother or son or something, on their T-shirts, people walking around with those shirts, like it's their grief is, they're wearing it, literally wearing it. And there are just a couple of really poignant scenes for me. One man who has multiple people listed on his shirt, who it's like he suddenly realizes that his grief is exposed, and he quickly zips up his jacket to hide the shirt. And then another scene was in the grocery store where a man is walking through, and a woman reads his shirt and turns her head away. And that was just such a brilliant opening, without saying a word, just the perfect description of how we handle grief in our society, zipping up the coat to hide it and turning away from it, not wanting to connect with the person who's grieving. So I just wanted to tell you how thrilled I was from the very moment this documentary started with how you introduced it. So anyway, after that, just tell us a little more about it.
Yeah, I'm so happy to hear that, because that was something, that's always a challenge with any film, is you have sort of this critical window in which to grab people's attention. And I kept thinking about, well, what can we do that's a little different? And I kept coming back to just thinking about how much we all carry. And then I just thought, you know what, we have to show people like actually wearing these experiences somehow, because it is. And I've heard so many people in interviews describe grief as heavy. That's a word that's come up so much. And so anyway, yeah, I thank you for those kind words. That means a lot. And I'm glad that's actually a lot of people have resonated with the T-shirts. So that's, people are wearing these T-shirts, and that's one of my dreams for this someday, is that we'll come up with some sort of like T-shirts that people can wear, or something to replace, the black armbands of days past, where we just put grief out there and we can make each other aware of what we're carrying. So maybe in the future that will happen. But so currently with the project, yeah, as you said, we have multiple platforms that we have used for this initiative. So there's the documentary, and that's currently airing across the country on public media stations. And there's information about the website on how people can find it. You can actually also watch it on the website. I'll say at the time of this interview, we're going to be posting it there starting on August 30th. So the full film will be available. And the website itself is really, I would just encourage people to spend some time there. There's so much more to this initiative than the documentary, which again, we're very proud of, but the website is really, it's really rich for both people who are grieving, but especially also for people who are in that support role. There are a lot of other stories there that we produced specifically for the website. So other families, other individuals sharing their grief stories, trying to widen, the telling of how common of an experience this is, and that we need to recognize it more. And there is we have a genius, Kristen Bittner's our instructional designer, Steve Nelson's our web designer, and the two of them, I think, just really did an amazing job synthesizing so much information. There are real practical tools for learning about grief in pretty succinct terms. There are tools for showing up for people, kind of the things to avoid saying, and maybe some guidance on things you could say or do instead. There's a lot there, both in video and in text. So I definitely encourage people to check that out. And then we're really using social media with, we started calling them these micro lessons. So, a lot of times we would use social media to kind of promote a specific project, but we really saw the opportunity with this project to use social media to actually extend that education. So even if someone is just flipping through Instagram, we try to put out these little sort of micro lessons on the reality of grief or on tips for grief support, in the hopes that even if that's the only thing they ever see, well, then, they know one thing now about grief that they didn't know before. So people can also check us out. We're on Facebook and Instagram at WPSU Grief is the tag. We're also, well, we had a lot of events planned. That was a big part of this, was outreach and screening events and discussions. And we created a toolkit for other groups who might want to have their own event. Obviously, we had no way of knowing that we were going to release this pretty much smack dab in the middle of the COVID-19 pandemic and shutdown. So a lot of those events have either been postponed or are moving virtually. But in a way that's been, it's actually allowed us, I think, to have a greater impact. So we had planned a local event here in central Pennsylvania, and that got postponed, but we were able to do a Facebook Live event that was really powerful, to get to sit there and kind of watch in that communal experience in real time and watching people speak their grief in the comments. We just saw people sharing about their losses, but then supporting each other and those expressions of grief. That was really a powerful night. So there's a lot of different components to this. Our radio team has done some great radio stories, but the idea is that they complement each other. But even if you were only to engage in one element of this project, we'd hope that you would walk away knowing something that you didn't know before about grief, or supporting someone.
Yes. And I have so much to say, because I love the website. As you said, it's really user friendly and the resources are amazing on the website. And I was thinking the whole supporting grief section is so important, because one of the reasons that people turn their heads and turn away when someone's grieving is that they wish they could be there, but they don't know what to do or say. And so this is the type of education we really need. And I think especially right now, in my mind, it's just perfect that you've released this during the COVID-19 pandemic, because really all of us are grieving right now in one way or another. And many people are grieving alone at home and feeling isolated. And so these tools that you're offering for understanding grief and supporting grief, and even grief experts and their comments are so needed right now. And that's why I'm excited to share the word with people, so that other people can come to this website and find what they need there.
And I want to give a shout out to our experts. A lot of them are featured in the film, but we also had a couple different advisory boards. So we had experts helping us with the content for the documentary, and we've had experts helping us with crafting that instructional content and the outreach. So they really guided this, because, we're storytellers. We're not, I think a lot of us now feel like we have maybe honorary grief degrees because we've spent so long in this, but we really relied on experts in terms of professionals, but also people who are grieving. So there are a lot of conversations that I had with people that didn't ultimately end up featured in the project. For one reason or the other, it's no reflection on the story. It's just kind of how things come together. But as we talked about earlier, having come to this as someone who hadn't had one of those life-changing losses myself, I really relied on the authenticity and real experiences of other people. And I'm so grateful for the people who gave us that. So that's something that means a lot to me, is that when people watch this, a piece of feedback we get a lot is that it feels authentic to them. And that is because of these conversations with people who were trusting and willing to share their story with me all throughout pre-production. I think it was something like 65 phone calls I had with people, just talking to them about, the reality of their grief. So we tried really hard to do justice to that in the website and on the website. And I want to say too, we're still adding content. So right now we're sort of between phases of the project where we're thinking about where we can go next. So the idea is that it will keep growing and that there will be more there.
Mm. And I wanted to say that the documentary it's this really beautiful tapestry of stories from various individuals about their grief and the process they're going through, interspersed with comments from experts that give us even more insight and understanding of what's happening. And so it has such a perfect pace to it. The stories are compelling and heart-opening. And when the experts speak, it gives us a little chance to kind of sit with that story as we're learning the expert perspective on what's happening with grief before we move on to the next story. And then also in the film, you have brought in such diversity in terms of the types of grief that people are experiencing. And so that was something fairly new for me to see as well, like grief over a suicide death and sibling grief, children's grief, and the secondary losses that occur after a death. So I'm really impressed with how diverse the topics were that you covered under this umbrella of speaking grief.
Yeah, thank you. And we were very intentional about that. We were very intentional about the types of stories we shared and the different types of losses. And even still, it's only an hour. It's hard to fit everything in. And that's where we really wanted to use the website as the tool that it is. So there are even more stories on there. And I think one thing I want to say too is with that hour being as short as it is and grief being such this huge amorphous thing, we focused this project on death-related grief. That is not to say that I don't think the content we made, especially on the web, can't be applied to other grief. We want to acknowledge that there are so many things we grieve, and especially right now, we're finding that jobs, the end of relationships, just the general uncertainty. We're all grieving the loss of our routine and stability, systemic injustice that we're seeing unrest around. All of those are valid grief experiences, and we just had to find some way to focus the film. But I would encourage people, even if they don't feel maybe that they're in a place thinking about death-related grief, is that these skills translate to so much of the pain that we carry in this life. I always like to borrow a phrase. Megan Devine's one of the authors and experts that we featured in the film, and she talks about this sort of fire drill of love. And the reason that we practice fire drills is so that when the big crises happen, we're prepared. And that's sort of the same with this work, I think, is that even if you might not be in the midst of a situation right now, it is kind of inevitability in human life that either you're going to be grieving or you're going to be interacting with someone who is. So this is the time really to start to develop those skills.
Oh, that's such a good point, and so true. Again, it's amazing that we're missing this piece in our education, that we've been missing it for so many years, that people don't receive more teaching and mentoring about how to be with grief and experience grief all throughout life, that we have just ignored it and avoided it so much in our society. But I love Megan Devine's comment about the fire drill, that you're right. And this film in particular, it's very good at engaging people who themselves are not experiencing the grief, but I would think almost everyone can, in listening to these stories, will be touched and recall someone they know and care about who has been through a grief experience, and will be drawn into it in that way.
Yeah, and that's kind of a tricky line to walk sometimes. Going back to kind of where we are with the pandemic and the shutdowns that have happened, we are all grieving things. And I think something that can happen in this space is we actually have been trying to engage that grief and other people. And to start, I always try to name my own grief experiences now, because I think grief is so weird sometimes that we don't always recognize when we're grieving something. And so we're all, when I have a moment where I'm missing something or I'm feeling anxious about something, I'll kind of name it for myself, that it might be a grief reaction to something I'm going through right now. But that being said, so I know there can be a tendency to think that when we talk about our grief, whatever it is, that there's like this automatic comparison that happens. And that's another mechanism that I steal Megan Devine's words of, that we really try to focus on that all grief isn't the same, but all grief is valid. So, an example I'll give is that I got into rock climbing the last year, and that is something that I got really into, and I'm really missing that community and that sort of physical and mental release that I get from that. And that's a grief experience. In no way am I comparing that to people who are grieving the death of a human on this earth that they loved, or a pet, or, it's, but they are still grief. So that's something that we're trying to tease out for people, is that I think for people who are in the throes of grief, when they start hearing other people talk about the grief, different kinds of grief that they're having right now with COVID-19, there can be kind of a defensiveness that we're trying to make that comparison. But I would urge people that the reason that's important is to let people speak their grief, no matter what it is that that's how we get better at this. Because if we can start recognizing our grief over, I don't like quantifying the big and small things, but, over things like hobbies that we're missing, or rituals that we're missing, going to coffee with our friends. If we can start tapping into those and paying attention to what those things feel like, or how often they show up, it does help build, I think, that empathy and a little bit of an inroad to start having those scarier conversations when we're talking about things like death-related grief, or illness or injury, or any of those things that are a little scarier for people. So I just like to urge people to have compassion and be open in that space, because that is how we start to have these difficult conversations.
Oh, that's such a good point. And when I think about it, I often hear people say, well, I'm sort of hurting right now, but it's nothing like what other people are going through who've had a loved one die. And then they clam up as if I don't have the right to even talk about the pain that I'm feeling, because it isn't the same pain that someone else is feeling. And you're right, we need to identify all of that as grief. And it made me think of in Buddhism, I know they talk about the little deaths of life, and that life is a series of little deaths, one thing after another, things that we lose, things that change. And to get good at navigating just life itself, we have to be able to acknowledge all of those losses and feel the pain of them without being embarrassed or something, that our pain isn't as big as someone else's pain, therefore it's not valid. It's our pain is our pain. So we each need to be able to experience it and embrace it as we go through it.
That's such a good point, because we do that internally and externally, right? We do that to other people and we do it to ourselves. So I think with other people, there can tend to be a defensiveness when in a comparison and grief, which again, I fully understand the impulse, but I think if we can reframe that, we do that to ourselves. And my last living grandparent, my grandmother, who, I had a great relationship with, died in this past February. And I've spent years immersed in this space now. And I always say, I know better, air quotes, but I fell into that. Well, she was 97. She, it's your grandma, you expect to lose your grandparents. Think about all these people that you've talked with who've had these, out of order deaths, and they're losing spouses and children. And I've had so many other grieving people be kind to me and show me that compassion and say, no, and validate my grief, even though it's not the same as theirs. They can still recognize my right to have my feelings of grief for somebody I love. So, and then that, sometimes the self-talk is harder. Sometimes we're able to hear that from other people, but I've had to self-talk myself that I, we are all allowed to grieve whatever it is that we do grieve.
Yes. And one thing that caught my eye on the Speaking Grief website was the idea of hijacking someone else's grief, that I think happens sometimes too. When a person is grieving, others may feel like, oh, this is my opportunity. I'll talk to you about my grief and what I went through. And the intention may be good of let's find some shared ground, but sometimes the speaker may have such a need to talk about their own grief that they overlook what the other person is experiencing and don't allow them to have their own space in that conversation.
That is such a hard thing, because I think two things happen. I think what you said is where we all, again, going back to the t-shirts, we all carry these griefs with us. And we don't often have spaces open where we can share them. So when that door does open, it can be really tempting to be like, oh, we're talking about grief right now. And I'll share, when I was on the road for this project, anytime I would be in an Uber, people would ask me, you're just making small talk. Like, why are you in Portland? Or, and I'd be like, oh, I'm here working on a documentary about grief. And then they'd be like, oh, well, let me tell you. And as soon as you say that and they sort of recognize that you're comfortable, it was fascinating how much like you can just tell that people are never given the opportunity to share these grief stories or to share. But I think the other thing that happens is that it's that tricky thing with empathy again, where we think that we're expressing our empathy for someone by saying, oh, I understand, which, let's all avoid that. We never fully understand. So there are different ways I think that we can offer to share our stories. But I think that temptation is there of like, oh, you lost your grandma. I lost my grandma. Let me tell you about it. So we can connect, not realizing that we're kind of hijacking or stealing that spotlight. And I think that's true of so many of the missteps that we do make in the space of grief support, is that they are very well intentioned. I think by and large, people are kind and loving and really trying. But again, it's not our fault. We haven't been taught this, but we do need to start taking some responsibility for educating ourselves and doing that work. But it's one of those things that's it's simple, but it's not easy. And it's we can always. There's one story that stays with me and haunts me. One experience that I had in my early 20s, I was having a sleep study done, and the technician said, I'm sorry, I'm a little out of it today. My dad just died. And to this day, I carry regret that I didn't acknowledge that. I don't even think I said I'm sorry, because I was so stricken and I felt so completely unprepared for what to say, that I'm like, I can't believe I didn't even say I'm sorry. But that's what happens to so many of us. So I think, it's not that we don't care, because I did not care in that moment. I cared a great deal. I just didn't have the words or the tools. And that's what we're trying to address with this project.
Oh gosh, that story. I mean, I would bet that every single one of us has a story like that somewhere in our past, of recognizing in that moment, I didn't have the tools I needed in order to respond, even though my heart said, do something, say something, wanted to connect, but not knowing how is one of the biggest obstacles that we face. And so which is why this Speaking Grief initiative is just so important right now and so needed. And I wanted to say something else about the film. I know I'm just like praising the film over and over, but I felt the film has a really nice transformative arc to it, even in the stories that we hear, because I love how it begins with the pain, the stories of the pain. Some people talk about things that made it worse or harder for them, but at the ending, there's just so much hope, because the people interviewed in the film start talking about what helped them and something positive that happened for them. And so it's a great reminder for all of us who might feel shame, like, oh gosh, I wasn't there for my friend when they had a death because I didn't know what to say, or I said the wrong thing, I did the wrong thing. For all of us to come to the end and see that, and for those of us who are also in the midst of grieving, that there can be light in this whole experience, and there can be hope, and there can be positive things that happen.
And I think the arc is different than we're used to seeing, or that's what we try to do anyway, because I think the hope that you're talking about, to me, that hope is the hope of connection, that grief is so isolating, that we feel so disconnected, that there's hope that we can get better at this and we can learn to love and show up better. And in terms of grief, the one thing I wanted to say was there's such that Hollywood ending so much when we see grief, where it is transformative, and we did try to talk about that in the film, but where there's this sort of super amazing thing that comes out of it, and that I think that shapes so much of how, that if you do your grief correctly, you get this amazing happy ending. And what we tried to show with the stories we took is that there is light at the tunnel, but for some people that might be a softer light or a quieter light, and that's okay. That, like, you don't have to go out and start a national movement, which is amazing for people who do that. But I think that can lead people, that can lead to more shame in our grief experiences if we don't kind of follow that dramatic Hollywood ending, and that our light that we find, or our transformation that we find, is a little bit quieter or softer. And so we really wanted to stay true to that in the film, of that, however you come through your grief, or I don't even like the word come through, because I don't know that we do. I think we integrate it. However you integrate your grief, by and large, if you're not hurting yourself or someone else, that's fine. That's great. That's perfect. You're doing your grief perfectly. Because I just think there's so much judgment and expectation and shame that gets lumped into this because of those kind of, archetypes or stories that we carry in our heads.
It is true. And it seems like a societal expectation of ours in a way too. If you just work hard enough and you just go through this hard time, like there will be, an amazing epiphany at the end of it, and that we may be setting ourselves up for disappointment and discouragement because of some of those beliefs that aren't really true or real.
It's definitely that kind of can-doism. And it's honestly, it's the same thing when it comes to the support side. So I think with grieving, it's like, okay, well, if you complete these 5 steps or phases or, whatever, that you'll come out of this, and you'll get this amazing happy ending. And I talked to one, a widower who wasn't featured in the film, but who was part of that preliminary research. And it always stuck with me, because he said, think about any time you see a widower in a Hollywood movie or in a TV movie, it's the fact that they lost their spouse or their partner is always a plot tool to lead them to the next person. It's always, it's always a setup for the next thing that happens. And, he was saying, he's like, I'm 11 years out. Like, I don't believe that I'll find that next person. Like, I still miss my fiance. And so I think there's that happens on the grief end, is that we think we're set, like that grief is setting people up for these extraordinary other things. And maybe it is, but again, maybe the extraordinary other thing is that they are finding ways to carry that person with them into this life that they're now leading without their person. And that is no less extraordinary. That is a huge feat. And then on the support side, I think it's like we want, and this was the challenge of this project, is that we want the checklist. We want our prescription of like the top 5 things you can do to be a rock star at grief support and never mess it up. And the fact is that does not exist. That's, I think, hard for people, but I'm like, I think it's freeing if you reframe it that way, of like, you will not be perfect in this space, because it's not a possibility, because grief is so dynamic and so unique and so deeply personal that it is almost without fail that there will be missteps. So that is not the goal. The goal is not to get it right every time. The goal is to start developing the skills to be there even when you're not getting it right, and to be able to come back to a mistake or an unintended hurt, and have a real authentic conversation with someone you care about, acknowledging that and figuring it out, how you can get together without being so scared off that you don't try anymore, that you stop showing up.
I'm so glad you brought that point up, because that's one concern I've had. I've seen a lot of blogs written with the title of "Don't Say This to a Grieving Person." And I felt like concerned that we already have a problem of people being afraid to talk to grievers. And now if all they see are articles about how bad it can be if you say the wrong thing, will that cause some people to shut down even more and say, gosh, I better say nothing, since there are all these things I could say that would be wrong. And I love your emphasis that it's okay, be there, try to connect. And all of us are going to make mistakes or be awkward at times, or say something that we wish we hadn't said, stumble over our words. And it's okay. We can always make that better if we just keep trying, and if we just continue to be connected to the other person.
And I think, and I have found some of those articles helpful. And I think the reason we have the don't articles is because it's frankly a lot easier to be able to identify what not to say in grief than what it is to say. But absolutely. And I think even as we were trying to write some of the content for the website, it's tricky, because we're like, well, you want to show up and offer things, but you don't want to take over and take someone's agency where, like there's all these kind of subtle balances, but it really comes back to that. It's about the deeper kind of ongoing skills of relationship and communication building. And, the one prescription I will give people is like, I don't know what to say is probably the only thing I can safely say is something that you can say, and it's probably going to be the right thing. Cause I've learned to say that. I've had other people say that to me, and I've heard other people talk about that. Oftentimes that is the best medicine, because there really isn't anything to say in a lot of these situations. And in going back to that, that can-doism or the prescriptions, is that that's really scary for us, because we're used to like, well, no, if I work hard enough, I'll figure out how to do this right. And it's like, there are some things that just are beyond words, and that's okay. And so and actually that saying that I don't know what to say, and acknowledging that the hurt someone's in is beyond words is actually really a beautiful acknowledgement of validation.
That's so true. And I have a personal story in that many years ago, my father died by suicide. And as I was trying to deal with my grief, a lot of my friends kind of stayed away again, because especially in the suicide death, they didn't really know what to say. But there was a woman who cleaned house for me from time to time. I hired her to come in, and she had heard about my father's death. One day the doorbell rang, and she was standing there with a plant that she in one hand and a vacuum cleaner in the other hand. She didn't say a word. She gave me the plant. She walked in with her vacuum cleaner, and she proceeded to clean my house without saying anything to me, and then turned around and left when she was done. And that was the most amazing grief support visit I had from anyone. And it didn't require a single word, but it's like she showed up, and she knew that I probably needed something. I probably needed some help cleaning my house that day. And she did it. And there were no words necessary. And in fact, it was almost a relief to me to not have to talk, to not have to answer questions or talk about how I was feeling or what was happening that day. Just her presence and her willingness to be helpful to me was amazing.
That's so beautiful. And I want to acknowledge, I'm really sorry about your dad. Can I ask what your dad's name was?
Clint.
What your dad's name is? I'm sorry to hear that that's a grief you carry, but I'm so glad that there was somebody who was able to show up for you like that. Those are the stories that, and that's it, right? Like you didn't have to ask for anything. Someone was just able to be there. And I think that can be scary for people, is that just taking a chance of asking or just doing something. But so many people have shared that that's what has been the most helpful, is just that concrete help. So I think that's definitely something we're sort of trying to put out there as an action that people can take, of either just showing up and doing something or offering some things. I'm out and about today. I have a little time. I could pick something up at the store for you. Would that be okay? Or, I'm just mowing the lawn, things like that. And I think something that we are going to try to work on in a future phase of this is also, we talked about grief being so dynamic and personal, but support's personal too. And that we don't all have the same skills or strengths. And there are sort of universal skills that I do think we need to and can develop, that ability to be authentic with each other, but that you don't have to be the all and everything for the person you're trying to support, because that's also not possible. That you can support someone being you and doing the things that are your strengths. So my example, we always think about like in grief support, we'll bring the casserole over. I am a terrible cook. Actually, I'm not even gonna say I'm a terrible cook. I don't cook. I just don't. I never liked it. I just don't cook. So I've done that. I've tried, or I've picked up food for people. That's not where I'm great. But there are so many other people out there who love cooking and who show their love through cooking, not just, I'm checking the box, but that's really what they put their love into. I'm better at other things. I'm handy. I can do things around the house. That's something I could offer, or something this is a huge thing that I've had to realize. I am now at least fairly comfortable sitting in the space of grief. I've had this opportunity to do some work in this. So I've started realizing I'm someone who's comfortable sitting and listening and just not saying much and offering. Like, we don't think of listening as like a tangible thing that we can do for someone or offer to someone. And I'm in that right now, where a friend of mine down the street just lost her sister. And I had that thought of like, what can I do for her? And I just said, hey, do you just want to come over and sit on the porch and, socially distance and talk and, tell me about your sister. And so whatever that is for you, and it's okay that we're not all, it's good that we're not all good at the same things, because that means that, but that's where the community aspect and the connection comes in, is that if we each show up for a person in need with the things we are good at, we're filling all those different needs, and we don't have to try to fill them all by ourselves. So I think that's something for people to keep in mind, because that's where it can get intimidating, is if you think that you have to be able to do everything for that person, but you don't. You just have to do your one or two things that you're comfortable with and that you can contribute.
Oh, I love that. I love that reminder that it's just about being your authentic self and bringing whatever you have to offer to the other person, and offer it sincerely. And maybe the person doesn't need in that moment what you bring, but that's fine. The fact that you were there, that you cared, and you brought what you had is perfect. That alone can make a difference for each person who's grieving.
Yeah. And yeah, it is. It's community. It's, each person has a little role to play. So if we can start getting everybody involved, then, then those roles will hopefully be there in those times of crisis.
Well, I was wondering, Lindsey, who are you reaching out to as a potential audience for Speaking Grief? Are you going for certain groups like hospice people or healthcare workers? Are there any groups that you're targeting, or do you have just a broad vision of everyone? Everyone should watch it.
I would say for phase one, it really is everyone. I think it's so foreign to most of us right now. It's still so scary, that what we really wanted to do, especially with the documentary, is to just make it approachable for people, and to make it a little, like, to demystify it a little bit, and really just invite people into this space and start getting them thinking about what they can do and getting better in these skills. And then we're thinking about where we can grow the project from here. And so this is where I think there's a lot of potential for us to create things for some of the audiences you said. I'll say particularly one of the things on our minds right now, and I think our strategy might be something for schools, not just for educators, but for kids and peer support for each other. Also for the people you mentioned, like hospice workers, or people who are kind of on the front lines of grief support and are most likely to encounter it. That was something that was really surprising to me, is talking to people even in counseling or in clergy, is how little that is often a part of professional training even. So I think there's a lot of potential, and there's a lot of interest in our team to see what we can do in those spaces to make more specific resources, even just generally in the workplace. That's a huge thing, bereavement leave is a whole different conversation. There's some great people doing some great work. Joelle Mulheron is one of our experts that we featured in the film, and her group Evermore does a lot of wonderful work in the area of bereavement care at a policy level, but even just in a being, if you're a supervisor, if you're a coworker, knowing how to navigate that space. Because I'll say it too, that's a space that I find a little more challenging, and I think I'm not alone in that, is that sort of a coworker or acquaintance space. Like, I feel a little bit more confident these days showing up for like people that I'm pretty close to, but it can be really hard when it's someone that you interact with, but maybe don't have that same depth of connection with, although a lot of beautiful connections do come out of grief. Is, that's the thing, is it changes relationships in both directions, right? Some people drop away, but then you'll be surprised by the people who are added into your circle. But there's just a lot. There's so much need, I guess. And so right now we're right in the middle of trying to figure out what we can do in this next round of the project that we hope to create.
So at the time our interview airs, this Speaking Grief will be available on the website for people to watch. So any individual listening could go there and see the film. Is that correct?
That is correct. So August 30th is our launch date. And my understanding is this interview will air after that. And it will be there publicly and permanently. And again, we also have tools there for people who want to make this more of a community experience. There's a great toolkit that was originally for in-person events, but I think there's stuff on there that can be adapted to virtual events. We've had people do screening parties or watch parties. So we would love for this to be something that people, and we've had a lot of people say too that they watched it more than once, because as you mentioned, there's a lot covered. There's a lot of ground to cover, and we tried to do as much of that as we can. But so yeah, the full film will be there. And then again, that whole other library of stories, there are a lot of great videos sprinkled throughout the site, but there's a particular section on the site, I believe, called Stories of Grief. And there are more of those profiles and family stories beyond what you'll see. Some faces, a lot of them were included in some of the footage in the documentary, and you'll get to hear more of the stories from the people who maybe you saw, in kind of a montage, but didn't get to hear from.
So I know a lot of people in my audience who listen are people who are trying to make changes in their own community. And I just wanted to say this film would be perfect. I could envision that it would work really well to screen it online and have people, coming together on an online platform to talk about it afterwards. And so I would just encourage people, watch it for yourself, take advantage of the toolkit that's available, and then get creative and think of who could you invite to see the film with you, or maybe you have your group watch the film individually on their own, but then come together and have a discussion group, because we are a society with this massive unmet need to talk about this subject. So anything that any of us can do to try to put it out there and encourage people to just have conversations, I think will make a difference for us and begin to move the needle in how we deal with grief in general.
Yeah. In our team too, we're happy to answer questions. If you have questions about the toolkit, or if you want to know something about, or have a question about hosting an event. And I'll say too that we're all missing that personal connection right now in terms of in-person, physical connection with people. But there's also sort of the certain magic that I've seen happen in some online spaces where we do feel a little bit more comfortable being open or being vulnerable in online spaces. That can sometimes go to the ugly side of human behavior. But I think in this space, it can be really an asset where people who might not be as comfortable sharing or attending in an open space feel a little bit freer online. So there is, I think, a lot of promise in these virtual spaces, whether it's a discussion or, if it's someone maybe who just wants to listen, but they don't feel comfortable joining in. That's the beauty of, if you do some sort of like a Zoom event or a Facebook event, you can just, mute your mic and take it in. And then if you want to speak, you can. But we're seeing a lot of groups do really wonderful, creative things to foster these conversations.
Yeah, and especially right now, as we said before, during the COVID-19 pandemic, I think this is really an opportune time. I think because more and more people are waking up to the fact that they are experiencing grief right now, whether it is the grief over the death of a loved one or just grief at all the changes that they're going through. And so there are people out there ready and willing, and this is one mechanism we can use to start those conversations. And so I think you mentioned to me before that the film is also going to be shown on public television.
Yeah, so Monday, September 14th at 8 p.m. is, I believe, it's going to be shown on PBS World. So that's a kind of one of the auxiliary channels of public television. And then other stations, local stations, are scheduling it independently. We don't have a single air date, but again, on our website, there's a place for Find Your Air Date, where as we get new air dates, we do publish those.
And I can link to that webpage. So if people want to watch it on public television, they can. And then I'll remind everyone, the website is speakinggrief.org, where you can go and watch the film, but also check out all the amazing resources that are available on the website. This is truly a gift that you've created for us, Lindsey. You, and I know other people too involved in it, but I just want to thank you for that.
Well, thank you for the work that you do in this space and for the opportunity to talk about this project.
Yeah. Before we go, I just wanted to ask you, do you feel that creating this project has changed your perception of grief at all?
Yeah, I think it, I think it did. I think it's one of those things, it's been so long, it's almost kind of hard. Change can be subtle sometimes. So I think it definitely, I'm sure I carried in the misconceptions that we all have, just because that's how it's talked about in our society of grief being this sort of finite thing, or this kind of set of, a few months you go through this. And I think that's been a big change, is just appreciating the lifelong transformation that is grief, that is any grief, that it changes us. One of the other things I've learned is that grief can be present in air quotes happy moments too, and that we get so caught up in these binary things. But I've heard different people talk about any of these big changes in life. You're excited to graduate from high school and see what's next for you from college, but there's a grief for what you're leaving behind. When you get married, you're of course happy to be joining your life with someone, but you're grieving your single life, so that there's grief present in so much, and just really trying to be open to that multitude of feelings that we're all capable of, and just holding space for that. And I think in terms of skills, the biggest thing for me is just paying attention. I'll pay attention for myself for when I'm in pain and thinking about what feels good for me, because we don't even always know what we need. And I also try to pay attention with other people, and really, we're all works in progress. I'm not perfect at this, but really trying to at least be mindful of how my urges to respond, or if trying to be compassionate with myself if I do make a mistake, that we are that work in progress, but really trying to pay attention to language. And one of the things that I really honed in on is the phrase "at least," because it's so prevalent. It's something we say all the time. And so I've tried to make myself stop saying that. And even the sort of smaller griefs, like, so with my brother is, he works for NHL, so he's currently quarantined in one of the bubbles right now, and it's hard for him to be away from his home and his partner and their dogs, and so he had sent me a picture of the view from his hotel room, and I caught myself saying I was going to text him back, "At least you have a beautiful view," and I just stopped and I changed it to just, "The view looks really nice," or I forget what I said, but I borrowed the words "at least," and I'm like, such a subtle change sometimes. But no, but that's again that fire drill so those little interactions, trying to just be aware of the impact that language can have, and trying to get more comfortable also with not using language. So that's sort of the irony of speaking grief, is that a lot of times it has nothing to do with actually speaking. It's sort of just learning this language of connection and compassion that is so often through silence or through action, but that we don't even have to say anything at all.
Mm. And I was going to say, one of the closing scenes of the film that I also love is, again, people wearing the T-shirts that, with the descriptor of the person who's died. And this time, when there's a woman who sees in the grocery store again, I think it is, who sees a man wearing wearing his t-shirt. And this time she looks at it and reads it, and she puts her hand over her heart. And you just feel like the love and empathy and compassion coming from her without a word, because it's a wordless segment. She doesn't have to speak anything. But I decided I want to be that person. I want to be that person who can look at and perceive and take in everyone's grief all around me and have compassion for everyone. And really, especially right now, recognizing everyone has some sort of grief that they're carrying and bearing. And if I remember that, even a person that I think is being obnoxious or that I'm somehow offended by, if I just remember, but look at their shirt, what grief are they carrying right now? And can I just put my hand over my heart and say, I feel that. I feel the pain. I understand the pain, or not understand, but I connect with the pain that you must be carrying right now. Anyway,
I love that. I love that. What's on their shirt. And I'll just, that's one last thing I think it's changed in me is realizing how much, again, just the paying attention of where grief is around us, but also trying to see through, not less than kind behavior sometimes in others, and trying to think about what they're carrying. I do think that's something I've always tried to do, but I think realizing how prevalent grief is, I'm trying to go forth with a better awareness that a lot of times what's really underlying a certain behavior is really pain that hasn't been spoken or heard yet.
Well, I will say that your film, you have fulfilled your passion, because your film is excellent at building empathy. And that is so beautiful. And it's something so needed right now in our world. So, Lindsey, thanks for doing the film, and thanks for talking with me today.
Oh, thank you so much. It's been a wonderful conversation. I appreciate it.
Yeah, best of luck with the film. I look forward to seeing where it goes and how it changes the world. I hope you enjoyed my conversation with Lindsey about the documentary film Speaking Grief, which, as you heard, I'm a huge fan of, and I really encourage you to watch it at speakinggrief.org. There are links where you can watch the film for yourself, and also to consider hosting it at an event. It could be an online event. It could be something that you do in your community and invite people to come together online to watch the film and have a discussion afterwards. I realize most of the people listening to this podcast are already tuned in to grief in many ways. So we are not so much the people who need to wake up to grief. We're probably already there, but we do need tools to help us explain to other people why it's essential that we recognize grief in our society, that we get more comfortable with it and become grief aware. So I believe this film, Speaking Grief, it's just a beautiful tool that you could use. I'd encourage you, watch it first, but then I think you may have inspirations for how you might be able to utilize it wherever you are, whatever type of work you're doing, to help other people get more familiar with grief. And at the very least, recommend it to other people. So share the link and encourage people you know to watch the film. It's a pleasant experience, actually, to watch it because it's so beautifully done. So I hope that you'll go to speakinggrief.org and also check out the website. Their initiative has gathered together a lot of different resources that are really helpful for people grieving. So it's a place you can send people who need to know more about grief or are looking for some testimonials from experts about grief, or who are trying to figure out, how do I be with someone who's grieving? The website it's a wonderful resource and a wonderful collection of information. So check that out. And as I mentioned, next week, we're going to be talking about grief again when I interview Brian Smith about grief to growth. So we'll have a little more to say about grief next week. And I mentioned this in the introduction that it's really important right now that we all tune in to the presence of grief in our society. within ourselves first. We each need to be aware of how are we grieving and what are we grieving that we have lost in our lives. Maybe we haven't had anyone we know or love die from coronavirus, but there have been some drastic changes in our society, in our social structure, in our communities, and no doubt those changes have had an impact on our lives. So take a moment and do a little assessment for yourself of how is grief showing up in your own life. And then from there, perhaps you can tune in and recognize grief in your neighborhood and in the community around you and within your own family, and be able to guide other people toward these important resources that can help them become grief aware and have conversations about grief. So don't forget the course coming up with Suzanne, the workshop we're teaching. Come to the show notes, eolupodcast.com, so you can learn more and read about that course if you're interested. Also, be sure to tune in next week for my interview with Brian Smith. And remember, there's always a new episode every Monday. I've really devoted and dedicated to producing a new podcast episode every single week so that I'm there for you. And as well, this coming week, I will be putting out another vigil on September 9th. I've been doing those once a month on the 9th of each month. So we're coming up to September 9th. So another vigil will be posted as a bonus podcast episode for you if you're interested in that. So if you enjoy the content of this podcast, please consider sharing it with other people who might benefit from it. You can also help support the podcast by leaving a review, either on Apple Podcasts or wherever you happen to be listening. That means that the podcast is shown to people who are searching for this kind of content. If I get the more reviews, the better, the more likely it is that other people will be led in this direction so they can tune in and listen. And you can also support the podcast by going to my page at Patreon, patreon.com/EOLU. And by signing up there to make a monthly contribution, you'll be joining my support team, keeping this show on the air, and you can also take part in some bonuses that I put out for you from time to time. So thanks again to everyone who's been supporting the podcast for the last few years. It means everything to me. So now until next week, remember that we're here for love. So face your fear. Be ready for whatever happens next, because who knows what might happen. And love each and every moment of this precious life. Bye-bye.